Welcome to Fright Fables. Before we start, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you're enjoying the journey, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. I've been a landlord for over a decade and I thought I'd seen it all. Late rent, trashed walls, abandoned junk, weird smells. You name it. But nothing prepared me for the day I walked into one of my rentals and found no doors. It started with a seemingly normal family, a couple with 2 kids and a dog. They passed the background check, had decent credit, and even paid a few months up front. The dad worked in construction, and the mom ran some kind of online business. They seemed polite, down to earth, and grateful for the place. Honestly, I thought I lucked out. For the first year, everything was smooth. Rent always came on time, and I didn't hear a peep from them. No complaints, no maintenance requests, nothing. It was almost too quiet. Then out of nowhere, they gave their notice to move out. No reason, just said they were relocating for work. I scheduled a walkthrough for the last day of their lease, expecting the usual minor wear and tear. What I got instead and was the most bizarre scene I've ever encountered. The house looked fine, clean even. The carpets were vacuumed, the kitchen was spotless, and there wasn't a single scuff on the walls. But as I walked through the living room, something felt off. It took me a second to realize what it was. The front door was missing. I froze, staring at the empty frame. The hinges were still there, but the door itself was gone. I thought, okay, maybe they took it off to move furniture and forgot to put it back. Weird, but not the end of the world. Then I walked into the hallway, and there it hit me. None of the doors were there. Not the bedroom doors, not the bathroom door, not even the pantry. Just gaping frames with the hinges dangling awkwardly, like the doors had been ripped out in a hurry. I felt my stomach drop. My first thought was, who steals doors? My second thought was, what else did they take? I rushed to the kitchen, the laundry room, the garage. Appliances? Still there. Fixtures? Intact. Even the light bulbs were in place. It was just the doors. Every single door. By the time I made it upstairs, I was half laughing, half panicking. The master bedroom was missing its door too, of course. But the closet inside? The sliding doors were gone. The ensuite bathroom? Gone. The attic access panel? Gone. They hadn't just stolen the main doors, they'd taken every removable panel in the entire house. I grabbed my phone to call the tenants, but of course they didn't answer. I left a polite but frantic voicemail, something like, "Hey, it's your landlord. Just wondering if you accidentally took the doors with you when you moved out? Please call me back." I immediately followed up with a text. Nothing. Radio silence. At that point, I decided to look around more carefully, hoping for clues. That's when I noticed the scratches on the door frames. Deep grooves like someone had pried the doors off with a crowbar. And scattered in the corners of each room were random hardware pieces, screws, broken hinges, even a couple of splintered wood chips. The creepiest part? In the kids' bedroom, one of the walls had faint pencil marks, stick figures, a crude drawing of what looked like a door, and next to it scrawled in shaky handwriting, "No one can find us now." I noped out of there so fast I didn't even lock the front door, or the frame, I guess. I went straight to my car and called the police. The officer who showed up was just as baffled as I was. He asked the same questions I'd been asking myself. Why steal the doors? What could they possibly do with them? Resell them? Build a fort? It made no sense. Still, he filed a report and said they'd look into it. Weeks went by and I heard nothing. I tried calling the tenants again, but their number was disconnected. The forwarding address they'd provided on their lease was fake, and no one in the neighborhood remembered seeing a moving truck. It was like they'd vanished. Eventually, I had to suck it up and replace all the doors out of pocket. Thousands of dollars, gone. And every time I installed a new one, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Like the house didn't want the doors back. To this day, I still wonder about that family. Were they just crazy? Did they have some bizarre obsession with doors? Or was it something darker? Something tied to that eerie message in the kids' room. No one can find us now. I'll never know for sure. But one thing's certain. Whenever I rent out a property now, I take inventory of everything. Working the late shift at a busy gas station, you see all sorts of people. Most nights it's routine. A mix of tired truckers, restless travelers, and the occasional sketchy character passing through. But this night was different. It started with a sound I couldn't ignore. The faint, heart-wrenching sobs of a child. It was just past midnight, and the place was empty, as it usually is at that hour. The sobs weren't loud, but they cut through the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional beep of the coffee machine. I stepped out from behind the counter, peering through the glass doors into the parking lot. That's when I saw her, a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, standing near the curb with tears streaming down her face. She was clutching a stuffed bunny that looked like it had seen better days. At first I thought maybe her family was just inside their car, and she'd wandered off. But when I stepped outside, I didn't see any vehicles nearby. The lot was empty except for the flickering streetlight casting eerie shadows across the asphalt. "Hey there," I said softly, crouching down to her level. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" She sniffled, her tiny shoulders trembling as she held the bunny tighter. "My mommy went to the bathroom and didn't come back." Her voice was so small, so scared. I felt my stomach knot. When did this happen? Where's the bathroom she went to? She pointed toward the side of the building where the outdoor restroom doors were. It wasn't uncommon for people to stop and use them, especially during long trips. But the idea of a parent just vanishing didn't sit right with me. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm for her sake. "Let's check it out. Maybe she just got a little turned around." She hesitated but eventually nodded, her little hand gripping mine as we walked toward the restrooms. The air felt heavier as we approached. The lights above the doors buzzed faintly, and the shadows seemed deeper here, like the light didn't quite reach far enough. "Stay right here," I told her, not wanting her to see anything that might upset her more. I pushed open the door to the women's restroom. It was empty, clean even. There was no sign of anyone. I checked the men's room, just in case. Same thing, nothing. No bags, no belongings, no sign anyone had been there recently. I stepped back out, trying to figure out what to do next. The girl was still standing where I left her, her bunny dangling from one hand now. "Are you sure this is where she went?" I asked gently. She nodded, but her eyes were wide, like she wasn't entirely sure anymore. She told me to wait in the car, but then I got scared and came to find her. The car. I hadn't seen any vehicles, but maybe it was parked somewhere further out. I asked her to show me, and she led me to the edge of the lot, where the faint outline of tire tracks disappeared into the darkness of the nearby woods. My chest tightened. "Did your mommy go into the woods?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just waited and waited." I stood there staring into the trees, debating what to do. My phone was back inside, and I didn't want to leave her alone again. I thought about calling the police, but something about the situation felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the unease was growing, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Then a noise, a faint rustling in the woods. My breath caught. The girl noticed it too, her eyes darting toward the sound. "Mommy?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Stay here," I said quickly, though my own nerves were screaming at me to stay put. I stepped toward the tree line, squinting into the darkness. "Hello? Is someone out there?" Nothing. And then, just as I was about to turn back, there was movement. A figure stepped out from the shadows. At first, I thought it was the girl's mother, but as they got closer, my stomach dropped. It was a man, tall, scruffy, and carrying something in his hand, something metallic that caught the light. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What are you doing out here?" He didn't answer, just stopped a few feet from the trees staring at me. I took a step back, my heart pounding. The little girl was still behind me, clutching her bunny, and I knew I had to keep her safe. "Is this your kid?" I tried again, though I knew the answer. He tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me, and then he smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculated. I felt my hands shaking as I instinctively stepped in front of the girl. "You need to leave," I said, my voice firm now. "The police are on their way." That was a lie. I hadn't called anyone yet, but I hoped it would scare him off. Instead, he took another step forward, and that's when I saw what he was holding. A crowbar. My brain screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. "Get inside," I whispered to the girl, nudging her toward the gas station. "Lock the door and don't open it for anyone." She hesitated, tears spilling down her cheeks, but she listened. As she ran, the man started moving faster, and I knew I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed the nearest thing, a loose chunk of concrete from the lot, and held it up like a weapon. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. For a moment, he stopped, his eyes flicking between me and the gas station. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared back into the woods, his silhouette vanishing into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I grabbed the girl and locked us both inside the gas station, bolting the doors and calling the police. They arrived about 15 minutes later, but by then, the man was long gone. They searched the area but found nothing. No car, no mother, nothing to explain what had happened. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. The little girl was taken into protective custody, and I was left with more questions than answers. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that rustling in my mind, still see that cold smile. And I wonder, did I save her just in time or was I too late? It was one of those rare family dinners where everyone actually showed up. My parents, my sister and her husband, my cousins, and my Uncle Jake, who was already 2 beers deep by the time appetizers hit the table. He'd always been the loud, joking type, but tonight his laughter was too sharp, his voice a little too loud. I figured he was just letting off steam. Family gatherings tend to have that effect on people. We were halfway through dessert when it started. Uncle Jake raised his glass, sloshing a bit of wine onto the tablecloth, and announced, "To family secrets." He laughed, but it was hollow. The kind of laugh you force when you're trying to cover up nerves. We all chuckled awkwardly, assuming it was one of his bad jokes, and tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but he wouldn't let it go. No, really," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "We all have them, right? Stuff we keep buried, but sometimes they don't stay buried." He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on my mom, then my dad. I saw my mom's grip tighten on her fork, her knuckles whitening. My dad stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. "Jake, maybe it's time to call it a night," my mom said, her voice tight, but Jake waved her off, grinning. "Oh, come on, Judy. Don't pretend like you don't know what I'm talking about." He leaned forward, his eyes glassy but sharp. "I've been carrying this for years, and I'm sick of it. They deserve to know." "Jake," my dad said, his voice low and threatening. "Don't." But the damage was done. The room went silent, the tension so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out. Jake leaned back in his chair, taking a long, dramatic sip of wine before slamming the glass down on the table. "Fine," he said. "I'll say it. You want to know why this family's so screwed up? It's because—" "Enough!" My dad stood up so fast his chair tipped over, the sound echoing like a gunshot. My heart was pounding, and I didn't even know why yet. I looked at my sister, her face pale, her eyes wide. Whatever this was, it was bad. "Sit down, Bill," Jake said, his grin gone. "You can't keep pretending, not after what happened." "Shut your mouth," my dad growled. I had never seen him like this before, red-faced, fists clenched. It scared me. Jake didn't back down. "You remember that summer, don't you? The one where Judy disappeared for 3 days? Where was she, huh? Where were you?" He pointed a trembling finger at my dad. "Tell them, Bill. Tell your kids what you did." I felt like the floor had fallen out from under me. My mom stood up, shaking her head. "Jake, you don't know what you're talking about. You're drunk." "Am I?" Jake sneered. He turned to me and my sister. Ask your parents why you never saw your Aunt Lisa after that summer. Go on, ask them. Aunt Lisa. The name hit me like a punch. I had vague memories of her. Long blonde hair, always smiling, her laugh like a bell. And then... nothing. I couldn't even remember when she disappeared from our lives. I had always assumed she'd just moved away, lost touch like so many family members do. Stop it, my mom said, her voice cracking. Tears were streaming down her face now. Please, Jake. But Jake was relentless. They buried her. Right out there, behind the old oak tree. You remember, don't you, Judy? You were there. I couldn't breathe. I looked at my dad, hoping he'd laugh it off, call Jake a liar, say something to make it all go away. But he didn't. He just stood there staring at the table, his face a mask of guilt. Is it true? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Dad? Mom? Neither of them answered. My sister stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. What the hell is going on? She demanded. What is he talking about? Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You want the truth? Your dad and I found her in the barn after she'd had enough. She couldn't take it anymore. The things he said, the way he treated her. It broke her. And instead of calling for help, instead of doing the right thing, we covered it up. We buried her like she was garbage. No, my mom sobbed, covering her face with her hands. It wasn't like that. She wanted us to. She didn't want the police involved. She made us promise. Don't you dare pin this on her, Jake roared, slamming his fists on the table. She was our sister and we failed her. I felt like I was going to be sick. The room was spinning, the voices around me muffled like I was underwater. I couldn't process what I was hearing. My dad, my stoic, dependable dad, had done something so monstrous, and my mom had helped him. We were protecting the family, my dad said finally, his voice hoarse. You don't understand, you were just kids. And you think that makes it okay? My sister shouted. You think we wouldn't have wanted to know the truth? The argument spiraled out of control, accusations flying, tears streaming, voices raised. I sat there numb, unable to move. My entire world had been turned upside down. The people I thought I knew, the family I thought I could trust, it was all a lie. By the time the shouting stopped, Jake had stormed out, my mom was a sobbing mess, and my dad just sat there staring at the floor. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't look at any of them. That night I went out to the backyard, flashlight in hand. The old oak tree stood there, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeleton fingers. I started digging, my hands trembling, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what I was expecting to find. Bones? A shred of fabric? Anything to confirm or deny the horror that had just unfolded. But I didn't find anything. Just dirt, roots, and the overwhelming sense that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. You never really know your tenants. That's something I've learned after years of renting out properties. People seem normal enough during a walkthrough, but once they settle in, you start hearing stories from neighbors or finding clues they leave behind. This one, though, this one still keeps me up at night. It started with a text from one of my renters. The guy, Ezra, had been living in one of my units for about 2 years. Quiet, always paid his rent on time, never caused any trouble. Honestly, the kind of tenant every landlord hopes for. But out of nowhere, he sent me a message saying he was moving out immediately. No explanation, just, I won't be staying here anymore. You can keep my deposit. That was it. No call, no follow-up, he was just gone. When I showed up to inspect the place, it was immaculate. Almost too clean. Most tenants leave behind at least a few scuffs or marks, maybe some junk they didn't want to take with them. Not Ezra. The house looked like he'd barely lived there. The only thing that stood out was the backyard. When Ezra moved in, there was nothing out back but overgrown weeds and a broken fence. But now, the place was like something out of a botanical garden. Rows of vibrant flowers, perfectly trimmed hedges, even a small stone pathway leading to a cluster of trees in the far corner. It didn't seem like Ezra's style at all, but I figured maybe he'd gotten into gardening to pass the time. Still, something about it felt off. For one thing, the garden smelled wrong. Not the fresh, earthy scent you'd expect, but something sour, almost metallic. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to fertilizer or rotting mulch, but the longer I stayed out there, the harder it was to ignore. Then there was the way the garden was arranged. At first glance, it looked random, just a mix of flowers and plants. But as I walked the paths, I noticed a pattern, a spiral. All the plants curved inward, leading to a small clearing near the center. And in that clearing was a mound of freshly turned soil. I don't know what possessed me to start digging. Maybe it was the smell, or maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, I grabbed a shovel from the shed and went to work. The soil was loose, almost too easy to dig through, and about a foot down, I hit something solid. Bones. At first, I thought they were animal bones. Small, brittle, nothing too unusual. People bury pets in their yards all the time, right? But as I dug deeper, I uncovered more. A lot more. Some were bigger, and the shapes weren't right. Too long, too curved. That sinking feeling in my gut started to grow, and then I found the skull. It wasn't an animal. There was no mistaking it. Human. Adult. My hand started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the shovel. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I should have stopped there, should have called the police immediately. But something about the way the garden was laid out, it felt intentional. Like Ezra wanted someone to find this. So I kept digging. By the time I stopped, I'd uncovered 2 more skeletons. One was small. Too small. A child, maybe. The bones were tangled together, almost like they'd been dumped in a hurry. And mixed in with the remains were things. A rusted locket, a cracked pair of glasses, a small, dirty teddy bear. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the cops, my voice shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. When they arrived, they cordoned off the area and started asking me questions. How long had Ezra been living here? Did he seem strange? Had I noticed anything unusual? I answered as best I could, but the truth was, Ezra had been a ghost. No friends, no visitors, no hints at who he really was. The investigation went on for weeks. The remains were sent off for analysis, and the police dug up the entire garden. They found more bones, more objects, enough to suggest that this wasn't a one-time thing. Ezra hadn't just planted a garden, he'd created a graveyard. The most chilling part? They couldn't tie any of the remains to missing persons cases in the area. No one knew who these people were, or how they'd ended up buried in Ezra's backyard. It was like they'd been erased. The police eventually tracked Ezra down in another state, but by then he'd disappeared again, leaving behind nothing but an empty apartment. Last I heard, the case was still open, with no leads on where he might be. I sold the house not long after. I couldn't even look at the place without feeling sick. But sometimes late at night I catch myself thinking about that garden, about the way the flowers grew so perfectly, so unnaturally vibrant. And I wonder, was it just the soil? Or was there something else, something darker feeding those roots? And wherever Ezra is now, is he planting another garden? I never thought a quick trip to the store could turn into one of the most terrifying moments of my life. It was late, close to midnight, and I just wanted to grab some milk and snacks for the next day. The store was mostly empty, just a few other stragglers, and the parking lot was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the asphalt like something out of a horror movie. I parked near the entrance, figuring it was safer that way. As I walked in, I noticed a guy loitering near the shopping cart return. He looked disheveled, baggy hoodie, dirty jeans, and this wild, erratic energy that made me uneasy. I told myself to focus on my errand and not overthink it. After all, it's not unusual to see someone hanging around outside a store late at night. Inside, I grabbed what I needed and checked out quickly. The cashier barely looked at me as they rang me up, and I remember thinking how eerily quiet it was. No chatter, no beeping from other registers. Just the faint hum of the store lights. When I stepped back outside, the guy was still there, but now he was pacing. My car was only a few spots away, but the second I hit the unlock button, his head snapped in my direction. He froze for a moment like a predator spotting prey, then started walking toward me, fast. I felt a jolt of adrenaline as I hurried to my car, fumbling with the grocery bag in one hand and my keys in the other. Before I could even open the door, he was right there, standing too close, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Hey, you got $1?" he asked, his voice slurred but demanding. "Sorry, man, I don't have any cash," I replied, keeping my tone calm but firm. I tried to open my car door, but he stepped closer, blocking me. "Come on, just $1, he pressed, his tone growing sharper. "Don't lie to me." I glanced around the lot, hoping someone else was nearby, but it was empty. Even the store entrance seemed farther away than it actually was. My pulse was racing as I weighed my options. I didn't want to escalate things, but something about his eyes, wild and bloodshot, told me this wasn't going to end with a polite no. "I really don't have anything," I said, trying to edge around him. That's when he snapped. He slammed his hand against the roof of my car, the sound echoing through the parking lot. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, his voice cracking with anger. "You think you're better than me?" I froze, clutching my keys so tightly they dug into my palm. He started pounding on the hood of my car, yelling incoherently, his words blending into an angry roar. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but my body felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. Then he lunged at the driver's side door, trying to yank it open. Thank God I hadn't unlocked it yet. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest as I hit the panic button on my key fob. The car's alarm blared, piercing the silence of the night, and for a split second it startled him. He looked around, his rage momentarily replaced by confusion. But then he doubled down, slamming both fists against the window. "Turn it off," he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "Turn it off right now." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the keys. I backed away, inching toward the store, but he didn't seem to care about me anymore. He was fixated on the car, punching and kicking it like it had personally offended him. That's when I heard the sound of a car engine revving. I turned to see another vehicle pulling into the lot, a beat-up truck with its headlights glaring. The guy noticed it too, and for the first time he looked unsure. The truck stopped a few feet away, and the driver, a big burly guy in a flannel shirt, rolled down his window. "Hey, what the hell's going on here?" the driver shouted, his voice booming. The guy hesitated, his bravado faltering. He took a few steps back from my car, muttering something under his breath, and then bolted, disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the lot. The driver parked and got out, his boots crunching against the asphalt as he approached me. "You okay?" he asked, his tone softer now. I nodded, though I could barely get the words out. Yeah, I think so. Thank you." He glanced at my car, which now had a few dents and scratches but was otherwise intact. "Lucky he didn't do more damage. You should call the cops." I nodded again, still trying to process what had just happened. The driver waited with me until the police arrived, his presence a comforting reminder that not everyone out there is a threat. When the cops showed up, I gave them a description of the guy, but I wasn't holding out much hope they'd find him. As I drove home that night, every shadow and movement in my peripheral vision felt like it could be him. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him running after me. It's been weeks, but I still can't shake the fear. Every time I park somewhere at night, I find myself looking over my shoulder, gripping my keys like a weapon. I know it's irrational. He's long gone, just another random encounter in a world full of them. But the memory of his wild eyes and the sound of his fists on my car stays with me. A constant reminder that sometimes danger is closer than you think. You know how family reunions can be awkward? Well, imagine one where you're not even sure the person showing up is actually family. That's what happened to me last summer, and honestly, I still haven't fully wrapped my head around it. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those lazy days where you don't plan on doing much except binge-watching TV and eating takeout. I was sitting on the couch, half asleep, when the doorbell rang. At first I ignored it, thinking it was probably a delivery for one of my neighbors. But then it rang again, and again. Reluctantly, I got up to see who it was. Standing on my porch was a man who looked to be in his late 40s. He was dressed casually, jeans, a button-down shirt, a baseball cap. But something about him felt off. He smiled when I opened the door, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey there," he said, his voice warm but unfamiliar. "You're Emily, right?" I nodded, already feeling uneasy. "Yeah, who are you?" He chuckled like I'd asked a silly question. "I'm your cousin Mark. You probably don't remember me, it's been years. I was just passing through town and thought I'd stop by." Cousin? My mind raced. I didn't have a cousin Mark, at least not one I'd ever heard of. My family wasn't huge, and I was pretty sure I knew everyone, even the distant relatives. But he said it so casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I think you might have the wrong house," I said, trying to sound polite but firm. His smile faltered for a split second before returning. "Oh no, this is definitely the right place. I spoke to your dad a few weeks ago. He said it'd be fine if I stopped by." That caught me off guard. My dad? He'd never mentioned anything about a cousin visiting. And why wouldn't Mark call ahead himself? The whole thing didn't make sense. "Okay, well, my dad didn't tell me anything about this," I said, gripping the door tighter. "Maybe you should call him and sort it out." Mark's expression darkened, just for a moment, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. "No need for that," he said quickly. "I'm already here. Mind if I come in?" I did mind. Everything about this felt wrong, but I didn't know how to say no without escalating things. Before I could decide, he pushed past me into the house, looking around like he owned the place. "Nice place you've got here," he said, wandering into the living room. "Cozy?" I stood there, frozen. My instincts were screaming at me to do something, anything, but I couldn't think straight. He sat down on the couch, completely at ease, and started asking questions. "So, how's work? Still doing that graphic design thing?" That stopped me cold. How did he know that? I hadn't mentioned my job to anyone outside my immediate family. My heart started pounding, and I forced myself to stay calm. "Yeah," I said slowly, watching his every move. "How do you know that?" He laughed, a little too loud. "Your dad mentioned it. We talked for a while, caught up on everything. I didn't buy it. My dad wasn't the type to share personal details with people, especially not someone I'd never heard of. I pulled out my phone and texted him, keeping the conversation going to buy time. "So, where are you staying?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Nowhere yet," he said. "Figured I'd crash here for a night or two." My stomach dropped. "Here? No, that's not going to work." "Why not?" His tone was sharp now, his smile gone. "We're family." At that moment, my phone buzzed with a reply from my dad. "Who's Mark? I don't know any cousin Mark. Lock the doors and call the police." Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You know what? I just remembered. I have plans tonight. A friend's birthday. So I can't have anyone over." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Plans, huh? Funny you didn't mention that before." He stood up, and for a second I thought he was going to leave. But instead he started walking around inspecting my shelves, picking up random items. "This is a nice photo of your parents," he said, holding up a framed picture. "When was it taken?" The question sent shivers down my spine. He was fishing for something, testing me. I needed to get him out of the house, fast. "Look, Mark, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't remember you, and my dad doesn't either. So maybe it's best if you leave." He turned to me, his face unreadable. For a long moment he just stared, and the tension in the room was suffocating. Then without a word, he set the photo back down and walked toward the door. "Fine," he said, his tone cold. "I'll leave, but you should really be more welcoming to family." He stepped outside, but before I could close the door, he turned back. "By the way, you should check your locks, not very secure." Then he was gone. I locked the door and every window in the house, shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys. When I checked the security cameras later, I saw him lingering outside for almost an hour before finally walking away. I reported the incident to the police, but they couldn't do much without proof of a crime. My dad and I contacted every relative we could think of, and no one had ever heard of a cousin Mark. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I changed the locks, installed more cameras, and stopped answering the door for anyone I didn't recognize. Whatever he was planning, I wasn't going to give him another chance. I'd been renting out properties for about 5 years, and while I've dealt with my fair share of weird tenants, hoarders, late payers, even someone who tried to keep a goat in their living room, nothing, and I mean nothing, comes close to what I found in that basement. It was a duplex I'd been renting to this guy named Alan for almost 3 years. Quiet, always paid on time, never caused any trouble. Honestly, I'd kind of forgotten about him until he called a few months ago to say he was moving out. No notice, no explanation, just said he was leaving the keys under the mat. When I showed up, the place was empty, completely bare. He even vacuumed, which I thought was a nice touch at first. But as I walked through the house, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it. The air was heavy, like the kind of weight you feel in a storm right before the thunder hits. The upstairs was fine, just a little dusty. But when I went into the basement, that's when things started to get strange. The first thing I noticed was the smell, kind of metallic, but with this sour edge, like old blood and damp concrete. I figured maybe there'd been a leak or some kind of rodent problem. The second thing was the walls. Alan had carved these weird symbols into the concrete. Circles, triangles, overlapping shapes I didn't recognize. Some of them looked like writing, but in a language I couldn't read. At first, I thought maybe it was just graffiti he'd covered up with paint. But no, the grooves were fresh. Then I saw the floor. There was this patch in the corner where the concrete didn't quite match the rest. It was smoother, newer, like it had been poured recently. And right in the middle of it was a faint crack, almost like someone had tried to seal something up but didn't finish the job. I don't know what possessed me to start poking around. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way the air seemed to buzz in that spot, like a faint vibration under my feet. I found a crowbar in the garage and went back down. It took a few good swings, but eventually the slab gave way. Beneath it wasn't dirt or foundation. There was a hidden compartment, maybe 4 feet wide. And in the middle of that compartment was a hole. A pit, really. About 6 feet across and God knows how deep. I couldn't see the bottom, even with my flashlight. The walls were lined with metal chains, like the kind you'd use to tow a car. Some of them were broken, but others still hung there, bolted into the sides. And there were stains, dark crusted stains that trailed down into the darkness. I should have called the cops right then and there. I should have backed out of that basement and never looked back. But I didn't. I leaned in closer, shining the light around the edges of the pit. That's when I saw it. A handprint. Small, like a child's, pressed into the grime near the rim. My stomach dropped. The air in the basement felt colder, and for a second I thought I heard something. A faint noise coming from the pit. It was so quiet I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then it came again. A soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, listening to whatever was in that hole. My mind was racing. What if Alan had been keeping someone down there? What if they were still alive? I forced myself to step back and grab my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. When the cops arrived, I thought they'd take one look at the pit and call in a whole team. But they barely seemed fazed. One of them, a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shined his flashlight into the hole, muttered something about it being a weird setup, and then told me it was probably just an old storm shelter or cistern. But what about the chains, the symbols, the handprint? I pressed. He shrugged. Graffiti artists, maybe? Kids playing around. I could tell he didn't believe me. They didn't even bother to check for fingerprints. The next day, I went back to seal the hole. I didn't want anyone else finding it. God knows what kind of people might be drawn to something like that. As I worked, I kept thinking about Alan. He hadn't left a forwarding address and his phone was disconnected. It was like he'd just vanished. I still have nightmares about that basement, about the symbols, the pit, and that faint, rhythmic sound coming from the darkness. Sometimes I wake up hearing it, like it followed me home. I sold the house a few weeks later. Didn't even bother mentioning the basement to the new owners. If they find it, well, that's their problem now. That's their... I'd just clocked in for my shift at the store, already dreading the monotony of another 8 hours of stocking shelves and dealing with impatient customers. It was mid-afternoon, and the place was buzzing with the usual crowd. Moms with screaming kids, teenagers browsing aimlessly, and older folks meticulously inspecting every price tag. It felt like any other day, but it wasn't. I was manning the self-checkout area, watching for people who needed help scanning produce or the occasional shopper trying to sneak an item past the scanner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was easy enough. That's when I noticed him. He looked like he didn't belong. Scruffy clothes, a hoodie pulled low over his face, and a jittery energy that made me uneasy. He was hovering near the canned goods aisle, tossing glances over his shoulder every few seconds. My gut told me something was off, but I didn't want to assume the worst. People get weird in public for all kinds of reasons. He eventually grabbed a basket and started moving through the aisles, but he wasn't shopping. He wasn't looking at prices or comparing brands. He was stuffing items into his basket with no rhyme or reason. A few cans here, a box of cereal there. Then he moved to the electronics section and slid a Bluetooth speaker into his hoodie pocket. That's when I knew. I alerted the manager, Stacy, who was nearby. She sighed, muttering something about how this always happened on her shift, and told me to keep an eye on him while she called security. I nodded, trying to act casual as I continued to watch him. He was making his way toward the exit now, his basket practically overflowing with stolen goods. Stacy intercepted him near the doors, blocking his path. "Excuse me, sir. I need to see your receipt," she said firmly but politely. He froze for a second, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "I don't have one," he muttered, his voice low. "Well, then I'm going to have to ask you to put those items back," she replied, crossing her arms. That's when things spiraled out of control. He dropped the basket, the sound of canned goods hitting the floor echoing through the store. From his hoodie pocket, he pulled out a knife, a long serrated blade that caught the fluorescent light. "Back off," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. The store went silent. Shoppers froze in place, some clutching their carts, others slowly backing away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I glanced at Stacy, who had taken a step back, her face pale but composed. "Sir, you don't want to do this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just put the knife down, and we can talk." But he wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, his grip on the knife shaking as he waved it around. "I need this stuff, don't you get it? I don't have a choice," he screamed. A few customers bolted for the exits, their footsteps loud against the tile floor. Others stayed frozen, unsure of what to do. I wanted to run too, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. Stacy was trying to keep him calm, but it wasn't working. He started pacing, his movements erratic, the knife still in his hand. Then he turned toward me. "You!" he shouted, pointing the blade in my direction. "Do you think I'm joking? Do you?" I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry and my mind was racing. What was I supposed to say? To do? Every survival instinct was screaming at me to stay still, not to provoke him. I raised my hand slowly, trying to show him I wasn't a threat. "Just take whatever you need," I stammered. "No one's stopping you." His expression shifted, almost like he was considering it. But then, out of nowhere, another employee, a guy from the stockroom named Kevin, decided to play hero. He stepped out from behind a display, holding a mop handle like a weapon. "Put the knife down, man," Kevin said, his voice firm but shaky. "You don't want to hurt anyone." The shoplifter snapped. He lunged toward Kevin, swinging the knife wildly. Kevin jumped back, the mop handle clattering to the floor as he stumbled. Shoppers screamed and scattered, some ducking behind shelves, others rushing for the doors. I dove behind the self-checkout station, my heart racing as I tried to stay out of sight. Stacy was yelling something, I couldn't make out what, but the commotion was deafening. I peeked out just in time to see the shoplifter grab a woman by the arm, dragging her toward the doors. She was crying, begging him to let her go, but he pressed the knife against her side, using her as a human shield. "Stay back," he screamed, his voice hoarse. "I'll do it, I swear I'll do it." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It felt like time had stopped, the entire store holding its breath as we waited to see what he'd do next. That's when the sound of sirens cut through the chaos. The police had arrived. Blue and red lights flashed through the front windows, and a voice over a megaphone ordered him to drop the knife. For a moment he hesitated, his grip on the woman loosening. Then with a guttural scream, he shoved her away and bolted toward the back of the store. The cops stormed in, their weapons drawn, shouting commands as they pursued him. I stayed crouched behind the checkout station, my hands trembling as I listened to the chaos unfold. I heard yelling, the clatter of shelves being knocked over, and then, finally, the sound of someone being tackled to the ground. When it was over, the shoplifter was dragged out in handcuffs, his face twisted in rage and despair. The woman he'd grabbed was shaken but unharmed, and Kevin was standing off to the side, visibly shaken but trying to play it cool. Stacy was talking to the police, her hands gesturing wildly as she recounted what had happened. As for me, I stayed behind the self-checkout station for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. Even now I can still see the flash of the knife, hear the panic in his voice, feel the weight of the moment when I thought someone might actually die. I've worked a lot of shifts since then, but I've never felt safe in that store again. Every time I see someone acting even slightly suspicious, my mind goes straight back to that day. And every time I hear a loud noise, like a dropped can or a slammed door, I feel my chest tighten, my breath catch. Some things you just don't shake. When we bought that house, I thought we'd finally have a place for memories. Family dinners, late-night conversations, holidays filled with laughter. It was supposed to be the foundation of everything good in our lives. What I didn't know was that it would be the backdrop for the most horrifying day of my life. A day I can't think about without my stomach twisting into knots. It started as a regular Sunday. My wife Lisa was prepping dinner in the kitchen, bustling around like she always did, humming to herself. She loved that kitchen. It was small but cozy, with the oven sitting snugly in the corner. That oven was old, probably as old as the house, but we hadn't gotten around to replacing it yet. I guess we figured if it works, why spend the money? Our two kids, Ellie and Jake, were in the living room arguing over which movie to watch after dinner. Their laughter echoed through the house, blending with Lisa's hums. I was sitting at the dining table scrolling through my phone, vaguely aware of the smell of garlic and roasting chicken wafting through the air. It was one of those moments where everything felt right, safe even. That all changed in the blink of an eye. It wasn't just a sound, it was a detonation. A deafening boom that felt like it ripped through my chest. For a split second, I couldn't comprehend what had happened. My ears were ringing, my vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt, and I remember falling out of my chair. When the world stopped spinning, I looked toward the kitchen, and that's when the panic hit. The oven door was gone, blown clean off its hinges. The glass window had shattered, sending jagged shards spraying across the room. Flames licked up the walls, black smoke billowing toward the ceiling. But it was the blood that froze me. Lisa was on the floor, her arms shielding her face, but her legs. God, her legs were torn to shreds. Bits of glass and metal were embedded in her skin, blood pooling around her. Her screams were raw, primal, a sound I can't forget no matter how hard I try. "Lisa!" I scrambled to my feet, but the floor was slick with oil and water, and I slipped, crashing down again. "Dad! Dad!" Ellie's voice cut through the chaos, high-pitched and frantic. I turned to see her and Jake standing in the doorway, their faces pale with terror. "Get out!" I shouted. "Take Jake and get outside." "But Mom..." "Go!" My voice cracked, but they didn't argue. They ran, and I turned my attention back to Lisa. The flames were spreading fast, crawling up the cabinets and across the countertops. The air was thick with smoke, making it hard to breathe, to think. I crawled toward Lisa, grabbing her by the arms. "We have to move," I yelled, but she just whimpered, her eyes squeezed shut. The heat was unbearable, singeing the hair on my arms as I tried to drag her toward the door. Every inch was a struggle. Her blood was slick beneath my hands, and the smell, the metallic tang of blood mixed with burning wood and melted plastic, was suffocating. I was halfway to the door when I heard it, a loud crack above me. I looked up just in time to see a chunk of the ceiling give way. It came down hard, grazing my shoulder before crashing onto the floor. Pain shot through me, but I didn't have time to care. I hauled Lisa the rest of the way, adrenaline surging through my veins. The kids were outside, screaming for help, but we live in the middle of nowhere. There's no cell service, and the landline had been dead since the last storm. I yelled for them to stay back, my voice hoarse from the smoke. Once Lisa was out of the house, I collapsed next to her, gasping for air. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. I ripped off my shirt, using it to try to stop the bleeding in her legs, but the injuries were bad. Too bad. "Stay with me," I begged, but her eyes were fluttering closed. I turned to Ellie and Jake. "Get to the neighbors, run as fast as you can." They hesitated for a moment, but then they took off down the dirt road, their small figures disappearing into the distance. I sat there with Lisa, my hands shaking, trying to keep pressure on the wounds. The fire roared behind us, and I kept looking back, expecting the whole house to collapse at any moment. It felt like hours before I heard the sound of sirens. The neighbors must have called for help when they saw the smoke. The firefighters arrived first, dousing the flames, while paramedics rushed to us. They loaded Lisa onto a stretcher, but I could tell by the look on their faces that it was bad. I climbed into the ambulance with her, holding her hand the whole way to the hospital. She survived, thank God. But the scars, both the physical ones on her legs and the ones in our minds, are permanent. We lost the house, everything we owned, but nothing mattered as much as the fact that she made it. Barely. Now every time I see an oven, I flinch. The sound of something popping, like a champagne cork or a balloon, makes my heart race. And sometimes, late at night, I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that boom all over again. I've dealt with a lot as a landlord. Late payments, trashed properties, even the occasional tenant who just disappears in the middle of the night. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened with apartment 3C. It wasn't just bizarre, it was horrifying. The tenant, Alan, moved in a little over a year ago. Seemed like a decent guy. Quiet, mid-30s, worked from home, paid rent on time. Honestly, I didn't think twice about him. He kept to himself, no loud parties, no complaints from the neighbors. If anything, he was the kind of tenant every landlord hopes for. But about 6 months into his lease, Alan started sending emails. At first, they were minor complaints. Stuff like the water pressure in the shower being weak or the fridge making a strange noise. Nothing out of the ordinary, so I handled it quickly and thought that was that. Then the tone of his emails changed. He started complaining about feeling sick all the time, headaches, nausea, difficulty breathing. He was convinced the apartment was to blame. Specifically, he said it was mold. He'd attached photos of what looked like small dark spots near the air vents, claiming the entire system was contaminated. I had the place inspected immediately, and the technician assured me there was no mold, just some harmless dust buildup. I passed that information along to Alan, thinking it would put his mind at ease. But it didn't. If anything, it made things worse. The emails became more frequent, more frantic. Alan was convinced the apartment was poisoning him. He started missing rent payments, saying he couldn't work because he was so sick. When I called to discuss the situation, he accused me of neglect and threatened to sue. I tried to reason with him, even offered to let him break the lease and move out, but he refused. He said he wouldn't leave until I fixed the toxic air vents. Then, about 3 months ago, Alan stopped responding entirely. No emails, no calls, no payments. I assumed he'd finally decided to move out, so I started the eviction process. A week before the court date, I got a call from one of the neighbors. She said she hadn't seen Alan in weeks and was worried something might have happened to him. My stomach sank. I went to the apartment immediately, knocked on the door, and when there was no answer, I used my spare key to let myself in. The smell hit me first, pungent, chemical, almost metallic. It made my eyes water and my throat burn. I called out for Alan, but there was no response. The place was a mess. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, garbage overflowing, windows sealed shut with duct tape. And then, in the bedroom, I found him. Alan was slumped in a chair, motionless, pale. A mask covered his face, one of those industrial respirators you see on construction sites. At first I thought he was asleep, but as I got closer, it became clear he wasn't breathing. I called 911, but it was too late. Alan was dead. The coroner ruled it as respiratory failure due to prolonged exposure to hazardous chemicals. At the time, they assumed it was accidental. Maybe he'd been using cleaning products in an enclosed space and hadn't ventilated properly. But something about it didn't sit right with me. After the police cleared the apartment, I went back to clean it out. That's when I noticed the vents. They were coated in a strange, sticky residue, yellowish and foul-smelling. It didn't look like mold. I called the same technician who had inspected the vents months earlier, and when he opened the system, he found several plastic containers hidden inside, each filled with a viscous, toxic substance. The air circulation had been spreading the fumes throughout the apartment for weeks, maybe months. I was horrified. Who would do something like this? And then it hit me. Alan. The containers weren't there during the initial inspection, which meant someone had placed them afterward. The technician even found fingerprints on the lids. I went through Alan's emails again, looking for clues, and one phrase stood out: "I'm going to make sure you pay for this." At the time, I'd thought he was talking about suing me. But now, it seemed like he had a much darker plan. He must have been trying to create evidence of a toxic apartment, evidence he could use in a lawsuit. But in his desperation, he'd poisoned himself instead. The police reopened the case after I turned over the evidence. They confirmed that Alan had purchased the chemicals online and that the containers matched his fingerprints. It was ruled a case of accidental self-harm, and I was cleared of any responsibility. But the whole thing left me shaken. I replaced the entire ventilation system, scrubbed the apartment from top to bottom, and even hired a priest to bless the place. Not because I'm particularly religious, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark still lingered there. To this day, I can't walk past apartment 3C without feeling a chill. Alan's death was tragic, but the worst part is knowing it didn't have to happen. Whatever demons he was fighting, they consumed him and left their mark on that apartment forever. You know how people always say, stay calm in an emergency? Yeah, that's easier said than done. I learned that the hard way when my kitchen almost became my tomb. It was supposed to be a quiet night. I'd invited a few friends over for dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread. I don't know why I thought I could multitask in the kitchen. I was trying to brown the meat, stir the sauce, butter the bread, and chat with my friends all at once. Big mistake. It started with the oil. I'd left a pan of it heating on the stove while I went to grab something from the pantry. Honestly, I don't even remember what I was looking for. Spices, maybe. Anyway, I got distracted by a joke someone made in the living room. By the time I turned back, there was this weird glow coming from the kitchen. The pan, the oil, it was on fire. Panic hit me like a slap to the face. I froze for a second, just staring at the flames licking up the sides of the pan. They were bigger than I expected, roaring like they had a life of their own. I grabbed the pan handle without thinking, and that was my second big mistake. The heat seared through the towel I'd wrapped around my hand, and I dropped the pan. It hit the floor, and suddenly the fire wasn't just on the stove, it was everywhere. I screamed, and my friends came running. One of them yelled, "Get water!" But I remembered enough from some safety video years ago to know that was a death sentence. Water and grease fires don't mix. They explode. My mind was racing, trying to remember what to do. Baking soda? A fire extinguisher? Did I even have a fire extinguisher? The smoke alarm started blaring, and the room filled with thick black smoke. My eyes were watering, and it was getting hard to breathe. The fire was spreading fast, crawling up the cabinets and onto the counter. The curtains above the sink caught necks, sending flaming bits of fabric floating down like deadly confetti. "Get out!" I shouted, coughing as the smoke clawed at my throat. "Everyone out!" But here's the thing. They couldn't. The fire had spread to the doorway, and the only other way out was through the garage, which was locked. One of my friends tried to grab the doorknob, but it was already too hot to touch. He pulled his hand back with a hiss of pain. We were trapped. My brain was screaming at me to think, but it felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, out of my body. I remembered seeing a fire blanket in one of the drawers. Or maybe it was under the sink. I dropped to my hands and knees, crawling through the thickening smoke, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to break through my chest. I found the blanket and threw it over the flames blocking the door. It smothered part of the fire, but not enough. My hands were shaking and my vision was starting to blur. Someone was crying. I think it was me. One of my friends grabbed a chair and smashed it through the window above the sink. The glass shattered and fresh air rushed in, but so did the fire. The oxygen fed the flames, and they roared higher, hotter, hungrier. I felt the heat on my back, like the fire was reaching for me. My lungs burned with every breath, and I could feel my strength fading. This was it, I thought. This was how it was going to end. But then, through the chaos, I heard sirens. Someone had called 911. Hope flickered in my chest. A tiny, fragile thing, but it was enough to keep me moving. I grabbed a dish towel, soaked it in water, and held it over my face. It wasn't much, but it gave me a few more seconds to think. The firefighters arrived just in time. They broke down the garage door and pulled us out one by one. I remember the feel of their hands on my arms, strong and steady, dragging me into the cool night air. I collapsed on the grass, coughing and shaking. My skin blistered and my hair singed, but I was alive. We all were. The house didn't make it, though. By the time the fire was out, there was almost nothing left. I stood there, wrapped in a scratchy blanket, watching the last embers die out, feeling a strange mix of relief and loss. My home was gone, but we'd escaped. Barely. I haven't cooked since that night. Just the thought of turning on a stove makes my hands shake. I keep a fire extinguisher in every room now, and I double-check every lock, every exit, every window. People say it was an accident, that I couldn't have known, but I can't help feeling like I failed. Like I should have been smarter, faster, better prepared. Sometimes I still hear the crackling of the flames in my dreams. I wake up choking on phantom smoke, my heart racing like I'm still trapped. It's been months, but the fear doesn't go away. Maybe it never will. I'll never forget that Black Friday, mostly because I'm shocked I walked away from it. I'd worked retail for years, but nothing had prepared me for what went down that morning. The store opened at 6 a.m., but people had started lining up around midnight. By 5:30, the line stretched out of the parking lot and around the block. It wasn't just regular shoppers. It was families, groups of teens, and hardcore bargain hunters, all bundled up against the cold, shoving and jockeying for position. I remember looking at them through the glass doors, feeling a mix of dread and disbelief. They're acting like we're giving this stuff away for free, I joked to my coworker, Lisa, who was setting up near the registers. She didn't laugh. By the time we started unlocking the doors, the crowd was chanting, "Let us in! Let us in!" It was surreal, like some kind of mob scene from a movie. The manager, Greg, was trying to keep it under control, yelling into a megaphone that there was plenty of inventory and no need to rush. Nobody listened. The second the doors opened, The crowd surged forward like a tidal wave. I was stationed near the electronics department, watching the madness unfold on the other side of the store. People were sprinting, grabbing carts, and elbowing each other to get ahead. The sound was deafening. Shouting, screaming, carts crashing into shelves. Then I heard a scream. Not the excited kind, this was different. Sharp, panicked. I stepped out from behind the counter to get a better look, and that's when I saw her. A woman, maybe mid-40s, on the ground near the entrance. People weren't just stepping around her, they were stepping on her, trampling her like she wasn't even there. She was crying, her hands flailing as she tried to get up, but the crowd kept coming, wave after wave, knocking her back down. "Greg!" I shouted, but he was already rushing toward the scene. He was yelling at people to stop, but they either couldn't hear him or didn't care. Then, like a domino effect, more people started falling. A man tripped over a knocked-over display, and the people behind him went down too. It was chaos. Absolute chaos. I ran to help, but as I got closer, I could feel the crush of the crowd. It was suffocating. Bodies pressed together. No room to move. I tried to grab the woman's arm, but someone shoved me from behind, nearly knocking me off my feet. "Stop! Everyone, stop!" Greg was screaming into his megaphone, his voice cracking with desperation. That's when it happened. A loud crash echoed through the store as one of the shelves toppled over. People panicked, scattering in every direction. Someone yelled, "It's falling!" And for a second, I thought the entire row of shelves was going to come down. I grabbed the woman and pulled her out of the way, practically dragging her to the side. Her face was pale and she was clutching her ankle, clearly injured. "Thank you," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. But it wasn't over. The stampede had shifted deeper into the store, and I could see Lisa near the toys section, looking terrified as people shoved past her. A kid was screaming, separated from his mom, while two men were practically wrestling over a discounted TV. Greg finally managed to get on the PA system. "Everyone needs to calm down and move to the exits. Now." Some people listened, but others didn't. I don't know if it was greed or adrenaline, but the crowd was out of control. More displays were knocked over and merchandise was scattered everywhere. It felt like the whole store was collapsing in on itself. By the time the police arrived, the damage was done. The woman I'd helped was taken out on a stretcher, and a few others were treated for minor injuries. One guy had a broken arm, and another woman was in shock, mumbling about how she couldn't breathe. The store was trashed. Shelves toppled, items ripped open, boxes strewn across the floor. It looked more like a battlefield than a store. And me? I couldn't stop shaking. Every time I closed my eyes that night, I saw the woman on the ground, her face twisted in fear as people trampled over her. I don't work retail anymore. I quit a few weeks later. Maybe it's dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that next time I might not be so lucky. I've been renting out properties for years, and I thought I'd seen it all. Trash-filled apartments, unauthorized pets, weird smells. But nothing could have prepared me for the day I unlocked that door. The tenant, Kyle, had moved in about a year ago. Quiet guy, kept to himself, always paid rent on time. I barely ever saw him, which honestly was fine by me. He'd send his checks, and that was that. But about 6 months ago, the checks stopped coming. At first, I thought maybe he was going through a rough patch, so I gave him some leeway. I left a couple of voicemails, sent an email or two, even slipped a note under his door. No response. By the third month, I was out of patience. I'd sent enough warnings, and the rent was adding up. I decided it was time to take a look inside, maybe figure out what was going on. Honestly, I expected to find an empty apartment. People skip out on leases all the time. What I found was different. The place was eerily quiet when I walked in, but not the kind of quiet that feels normal. It was heavy, oppressive, like the silence had weight to it. The living room was clean, almost too clean. No dishes in the sink, no laundry lying around, no signs of life at all. It didn't look like anyone had been there for months. Then I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but the closer I got to the bedroom door, the stronger it became. That sickly sweet rotting smell you never forget once you've smelled it. I tried knocking, more out of habit than anything else. Of course, there was no answer. The door was locked, and I had this sinking feeling in my gut. Something was wrong. I called a locksmith who arrived within the hour. He gave me a weird look when he smelled the air, but he didn't ask any questions. With a few twists of his tools, the door swung open and there he was. Kyle was slumped in the corner of the room, half covered by a thin, stained blanket. His skin was gray, his body bloated and twisted, his eyes sunken into his skull. It was clear he'd been there for a long time. The smell hit me like a punch in the face, and I stumbled back, gagging. I couldn't believe it. He'd been dead for months, and no one, not his family, not his friends, not his neighbors, had said a word. The police came quickly, sealed off the place, and took Kyle's body away. They told me it looked like a suicide. Pills, they said. There was an empty bottle on the floor next to him. The officer in charge was calm, almost clinical about it, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Something wasn't sitting right with him either. After the cops left, I had to go back in to start cleaning up, or at least to figure out what I was dealing with. That's when I found the journal. It was sitting on the nightstand, black leather, with Kyle's name etched on the cover. I hesitated before opening it, feeling like I was intruding on something private, but curiosity got the better of me. The entries started off normal enough. Mundane stuff about work, the weather, how he was struggling to make friends in the city. But as I flipped through, the tone changed. His handwriting grew messier, the entries shorter, more frantic. He wrote about hearing noises at night, whispers, footsteps, the sound of something brushing against the walls. At first he thought it was the neighbors, but then he started to believe it was coming from inside his apartment. The later entries were disturbing. He described waking up to find things moved around his room. Drawers open, clothes strewn on the floor. He swore he saw shadows that didn't belong to him. He wrote about locking his bedroom door every night only to wake up and find it unlocked. The last few entries made my skin crawl. One of them said, "I'm not alone in here. I can feel it watching me when I sleep." Another read, "It doesn't want me to leave. I think it's been here all along." The very last entry, written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting, said, "I hear it breathing. It's in the room with me." I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. There was no sign of anyone else in that apartment. No footprints, no extra belongings, nothing. And yet the way Kyle described it, it didn't feel like a delusion. It felt real. The apartment sat empty for months after that. No matter how much I cleaned, I couldn't get rid of that smell, that feeling. Eventually, I sold the place dirt cheap to some property investor who didn't ask too many questions. I didn't tell him about Kyle, or the journal, or the way I sometimes felt like someone was watching me every time I stepped inside. I still think about that room sometimes, about the chains on the inside of the closet door, like someone had tried to lock themselves in, or lock something out. About the scratches on the floorboards near the corner where Kyle died, like someone, or something, had been clawing at the wood. Most of all, I think about those last words in his journal. It's in the room with me. And I wonder, what if it still is? It was supposed to be an easygoing Sunday dinner with friends, just a few of us catching up, laughing, sharing some drinks. It was the kind of night where the biggest worry was whether we'd run out of wine before dessert. I never thought I'd spend the evening fighting to save someone's life. Dinner was already underway and we were about halfway through the meal. It wasn't fancy, just spaghetti, garlic bread, and some salads. But it felt special because everyone had shown up for once. The chatter was loud, the laughter constant. I remember sitting at the head of the table, watching everyone joke and eat, thinking, this is nice. This is exactly what I needed. That's when I noticed Greg. He was sitting across from me, his plate piled high the way he always did. Greg loved food. He was the guy who always went back for seconds, then thirds without shame. Except now, he wasn't eating. His face was red, and he was gripping his throat. At first I thought it was just him being dramatic. He was always a joker, pulling faces or doing impressions. But then his chair scraped back violently and he stood up, his hands clawing at his neck. He made this horrible gagging sound, and that's when it clicked. Greg wasn't joking. He was choking. The laughter around the table stopped instantly. Everyone froze, looking at each other like, is this really happening? What do we do? Greg, can you talk? I asked, standing up so fast my chair tipped over. He shook his head, his eyes wide and watering. Someone help him, Lisa shouted, her voice high-pitched with panic. I've got it, said Mark, sitting closest to Greg. He jumped up and got behind him, wrapping his arms around Greg's middle. I remember thinking, thank God, Mark knows the Heimlich, but that relief didn't last. Mark yanked upward, once, twice, but nothing happened. Greg's face turned an even deeper shade of red and the gagging stopped altogether. He was silent now, just clutching at his throat like he was trying to pull the blockage out himself. Harder, Mark. Do it harder, Lisa screamed. Mark tried again, but his hands slipped and Greg stumbled forward, collapsing onto the table. Plates and glasses clattered to the floor, the spaghetti sauce smearing across the white tablecloth like blood. He's not breathing, someone yelled. Panic set in like a wave, crashing over all of us. Lisa grabbed her phone, trying to call 911, but her hands were shaking so badly that she fumbled it onto the floor. I don't know how to do it, Mark admitted, stepping back, his face pale. Move, I shouted, shoving my way to Greg. I'd only ever seen the Heimlich done on TV, but instinct took over. I wrapped my arms around him and pulled as hard as I could. Nothing. Come on, Greg, come on, I was practically shouting in his ear. I tried again, harder this time, my arms aching from the effort. His body jerked, but still nothing came out. The room was chaos, people yelling instructions, others crying, the sound of Lisa's frantic 911 call in the background. Greg's knees buckled and he went limp, dragging me down with him as we both hit the floor. Don't let him die, Lisa sobbed, kneeling beside us. I tilted Greg onto his back, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I knew we were running out of time. His face was turning purple, his lips blue. Do chest compressions, someone yelled. I don't know how, I snapped back, my hands hovering uselessly over his chest. Just then, Sarah, quiet, introverted Sarah, pushed through the group. Let me try, she said, her voice trembling but determined. She knelt over Greg, positioned her hands, and started compressions. Her movements were strong and steady, and for the first time I felt a sliver of hope. After what felt like an eternity, Greg suddenly convulsed, rolling onto his side and coughing violently. A chunk of garlic bread flew out of his mouth, landing with a wet thud on the floor. We all froze, staring at the disgusting piece of bread like it was some kind of miracle. Greg gasped for air, his chest heaving as his color slowly returned. Holy shit, he rasped, his voice hoarse. Everyone erupted at once, half laughing in relief, half crying from the emotional overload. Lisa hugged him so tightly that he had to push her off, muttering something about needing space to breathe. The paramedics arrived a few minutes later, finding us all huddled around Greg, who was still lying on the floor, looking dazed but alive. They checked him out, and after some oxygen and a quick exam, they said he'd be fine. That night should have been a wake-up call, a reminder to learn CPR or the Heimlich properly. But honestly, I couldn't even bring myself to think about it. All I could do was replay the moment Greg stopped breathing over and over in my head. Even now, months later, I can't sit down to a meal without watching everyone like a hawk, waiting for someone to choke. And garlic bread? It's banned from my house forever. It was just another ordinary Tuesday, the kind where you're counting the hours until your shift ends and you can finally go home. I was working the register at the store, a soul-sucking job, but it paid the bills, and things were moving at their usual snail's pace. The fluorescent lights were buzzing overhead, a constant reminder of how much I hated this place. But I had no idea that by the end of the day, I'd be rethinking every decision that led me to that moment. The shift had been pretty uneventful up until around 3 p.m. That's when Brian walked in. He wasn't on the schedule, which was weird. Brian was a stockroom guy, Not the friendliest person, but he kept to himself, which was fine by me. But that day he had this energy about him. His eyes were darting around like he was trying to keep track of everything at once, and his hands wouldn't stay still. "Hey, Brian," I said, forcing a smile because, polite workplace stuff. He didn't respond, just kept walking, heading straight for the break room. That's when I should have known something was off. Normally, he'd at least grunt or nod, but not this time. He was muttering under his breath, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I told myself he was probably just having a bad day. Everyone has bad days, right? The store wasn't busy, just a couple of customers browsing and the usual mix of coworkers doing their thing. Nothing screamed imminent disaster. But then I heard it. A loud crash from the back, like someone had knocked over a whole shelf of inventory. Everyone froze for a second, looking toward the stockroom. "Brian, you okay back there?" Our manager, Laura, called out, trying to keep it light. No response. I exchanged a look with Jamie, the girl working the floor, and she shrugged. Laura sighed and walked to the back to check on him. A few seconds later, we all heard shouting. Not Laura shouting, Brian. His voice was low and guttural, nothing like his usual tone. Then there was another crash and Laura came storming out, her face pale. "Everyone stay out of the back," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "Brian's upset, I'm calling the police." That's when the tension in the room skyrocketed. You could feel it in the air, like a rubber band stretched way too tight. I wanted to believe it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but then Brian appeared and all hope of that went out the window. He came out of the stockroom carrying a metal pipe he must have grabbed from the maintenance closet. His shirt was ripped and there was this wild look in his eyes like he wasn't seeing any of us, just whatever was playing out in his mind. "Everybody shut up," he screamed, even though no one was talking. A couple of customers bolted for the door, but Brian moved fast, slamming it shut and locking it with a key I didn't even know he had. Now we were trapped. "What the hell, Brian?" Laura tried to keep her voice calm, but you could hear the tremble underneath. "Just put the pipe down, okay? Let's talk about this." Brian laughed, a cold, humorless laugh that sent shivers down my spine. "Talk? Talk? You think talking's gonna fix this?" He started pacing, the pipe swinging in his hand. "You think I don't know what you all say about me? Behind my back to my face, I hear it. I hear all of it." Jamie was standing near me, her hand gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles were white. "What do we do?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. My brain was stuck between fight or flight, but neither option felt remotely safe. Brian started smashing things, displays, shelves, anything within reach. The sound of shattering glass and snapping wood filled the store. One customer, an older guy, tried to reason with him, stepping forward with his hands up. "Hey man, no one here wants trouble. Just let us go, and we won't say anything." Brian turned on him so fast it was like watching a predator lock onto prey. "You think I care about what you'll say?" He swung the pipe, barely missing the guy's head, and the man scrambled back, tripping over a fallen display. Brian laughed again, but it wasn't just anger, it was something unhinged, something that made my stomach churn. Laura tried to move toward the phone behind the counter, but Brian caught her. "Don't even think about it," he snapped, pointing the pipe at her like it was a weapon. She froze, her hands raised, and for a second, everything went silent except for our breathing. Then Jamie's phone buzzed. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet, and Brian's head whipped around. He stalked toward her, and I panicked. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest thing, an empty coffee mug from the counter, and chucked it at him. It hit his shoulder, not hard enough to hurt, but enough to get his attention. "Leave her alone," I yelled, my voice shaking. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity. I thought he was going to come at me, but instead he just laughed. "You're brave now, huh? You think you're a hero?" Before I could respond, there was a loud pounding on the glass doors. The police. Someone must have hit the silent alarm. Maybe Laura, maybe one of the customers. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Brian didn't drop the pipe or back down. If anything, he seemed even more agitated. "They're not taking me," he screamed, running back toward the stockroom. The police burst in seconds later, guns drawn, shouting commands. They surrounded the stockroom entrance, and for a terrifying moment I thought Brian was going to come out swinging. But then we heard the pipe drop and the officers rushed in. When they brought him out in handcuffs, he was muttering to himself, his eyes darting around like he didn't even recognize us. They escorted him out, and just like that it was over. Except it wasn't. Not really. The store was wrecked, broken shelves, shattered glass, merchandise scattered everywhere. But that wasn't what stuck with me. It was Brian's face, that wild, empty look in his eyes. I kept replaying the moment he pointed the pipe at Laura, wondering what would have happened if the cops hadn't shown up when they did. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brian. His laughter, his anger, the way he swung that pipe like it was nothing. I don't work at that store anymore, but I still get nervous whenever someone's too quiet or seems a little off. Because now I know, sometimes the people who seem harmless are the ones you need to fear the most. So it's Thanksgiving, and we were on our way to my in-laws' house a couple of hours out of town. It was supposed to be a nice, quiet drive, a chance to catch up, laugh, and maybe sing along to some cheesy holiday songs with the kids. The roads weren't even that busy. Just a few cars here and there, mostly families like us trying to make it in time for turkey. Everything was fine until we hit this long stretch of highway. It was one of those desolate roads with nothing but trees on either side. I was cruising a little over the speed limit, not much, just enough to keep the trip moving, when this black truck came out of nowhere, riding right on my bumper. I mean, right there. At first I thought, okay, maybe they're in a rush, no big deal. I flipped on my blinker, changed lanes, and figured they'd pass. But they didn't. Instead, they swerved into my lane behind me again, closer this time, their headlights practically burning into the back of our car. My wife Emily glanced back and said, "What's their problem?" Her voice was calm, but I could tell she was nervous. "I don't know," I said, trying to brush it off. Probably just an impatient jerk. I tapped my brakes lightly, not enough to cause anything, just to send a message. Bad move. The truck swerved into the other lane, sped up, and pulled alongside us. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see the driver, but they rolled down their passenger window just enough to throw something, maybe a soda can, at our car. It clattered off the side, and I heard my daughter in the back gasp. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked, her voice small and shaky. She's only 8, and I could tell she was scared. "It's fine, sweetie," I said, trying to sound steady. "Just a rude driver, nothing to worry about." But inside, I was panicking. The truck didn't speed off after their little stunt. Instead, they fell back behind us, their headlights flashing on and off, almost like they were taunting us. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice a little more urgent now. "Let's just keep driving," I said. "There's got to be an exit or a gas station up ahead." The truck followed us for miles. Every time I tried to speed up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down. They'd get right on our tail, then fall back, then swerve next to us like they were playing some sick game. And then they started honking. Not just a quick honk, but this long, blaring sound that wouldn't stop. The kids were crying now, and Emily was trying to calm them down, but I could hear the fear in her voice too. Finally, I spotted an exit sign for a rest area. It was one of those places with a gas station, a diner, and a parking lot full of semi-trucks. I figured if we could get off the highway and into a crowded area, maybe they'd back off. I took the exit, and for a moment, it seemed like they weren't going to follow. Relief started to wash over me, but then I saw their headlights in the rearview mirror. They were still there. The rest area was busy, thank God. I pulled into a spot near the gas station, right under the bright lights, and parked. The truck pulled in too, parking a few spaces away. The driver still didn't get out. They just sat there, the engine idling. Emily looked at me, her face pale. "What do we do now?" "Stay here," I said. "Lock the doors. I'm going to go inside and tell someone." "No," she said, grabbing my arm. "Don't leave us." Before I could respond, the truck's door opened. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black hoodie pulled up over his head. He started walking toward us, slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I rolled down the window just enough to yell, "What do you want?" He didn't answer. He just kept walking, his hands in his pockets. "Call the police," I told Emily, "right now." She fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking so much she could barely unlock it. The man stopped a few feet from our car, staring at me. His face was shadowed by the hoodie, but I could see just enough to tell he was smiling. Not a friendly smile, a twisted, malicious one. And then, as suddenly as it started, it ended. He turned around, walked back to his truck, got in, and drove off. We sat there for a long time, not saying anything, just trying to process what had happened. When the police finally arrived, they took our statement and promised to look into it, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. Just some road rage, they said. Happens all the time. But it wasn't just road rage. It felt personal, targeted, like he wanted to see how far he could push us. And honestly, that's the scariest part. Knowing someone out there gets a thrill out of terrifying families just trying to get to Thanksgiving dinner. I still see his smile in my nightmares, and I haven't taken a road trip since.